From New York, this is Democracy Now! We're breaking with convention.
Let it be clear, this administration is waging an authoritarian campaign to sabotage this election by manipulating the Postal Service to suppress our votes. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is fascism. We will not stand for this now or ever.
The House approves a $25 billion bill to help the U.S. Postal Service and stop the new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, from issuing more cost-cutting measures as President Trump continues to attack mail-in voting. We'll speak to a former letter carrier who became a historian studying the Postal Service. Then we look at the arrest of Trump's former campaign manager, Steve Bannon, and others on fraud charges connected to his We Build the Wall effort. And we'll discuss President Trump's embrace of the far-right QAnon conspiracy theory ahead of today's Republican National Convention. While the FBI sees QAnon as a domestic terrorist threat, Trump has taken a different approach.
Well, I don't know much about the movement other than I understand they like me very much, which I appreciate. And I've heard these are people that love our country.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We're breaking with convention. Record wildfires in California have prompted officials to issue new red flag warnings, with high temperatures and gusty winds threatening to make an already historic series of wildfires even worse. At least 6 people have died. Nearly 120,000 have fled their homes as 1.2 million acres have already burned, an area larger than the state of Rhode Island. 2 of the wildfires rank as the second and third largest fires in California's history. The fires were triggered by an estimated 12,000 dry lightning strikes amidst a record-shattering heat wave driven by the climate crisis. CAL FIRE reports a severe shortage of firefighter labor as prisoner firefighters have been idled or granted early release amidst massive coronavirus outbreaks at state prisons. The confirmed U.S. death toll from COVID-19 has topped 176,000, with over 5.7 million recorded infections. On Sunday, the Food and Drug Administration issued an emergency use authorization for blood plasma in the treatment of COVID-19, saying, quote, the known and potential benefits of the product outweigh the known and potential risks of the product. Over 70,000 patients have already been treated with plasma from recovered patients. The news came just one day after President Trump accused the FDA of delaying approval of coronavirus treatments and vaccines and being part of the deep state without any evidence. Some top health officials, including White House Corona advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's recovering from throat surgery, have questioned whether the data on the blood plasma study was still too weak, with no randomized studies, to grant an FDA approval. This comes amidst rising concern over outbreaks in schools around the country, as at least 36 states so far have reported cases on college campuses. Meanwhile, ProPublica reports meatpacking companies, another major source of coronavirus outbreaks, were regularly warned about the potential for a pandemic as early as 2006, but executives ignored and in some cases mocked recommendations for handling one. Here in New York City, a protest under the banner March for the Dead took place Friday to memorialize the over 175,000 lives lost so far. Families of victims of COVID-19 called out Trump for his mishandling of the pandemic as they marched across the Brooklyn Bridge to the Trump building in Lower Manhattan. Globally, the confirmed coronavirus death toll has topped 807,000. The United States has recorded the most deaths, with 25% of the deaths, yet under 5% of the population, followed by Brazil, Mexico, and India, which crossed the 3 million mark for cases on Sunday. Meanwhile, countries including Australia, Spain, and South Korea are grappling with a second wave of the virus. This is the director of the South Korean Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
최근 들어서 3일 연속 We've been having more than 300 patients for 3 consecutive days. It is not just happening in the capital area, but in 17 cities and provinces nationwide. We are in a very grave and serious situation facing a nationwide pandemic.
South Korea has closed more than 2,000 schools. In Peru, which is the second most infected country in Latin America after Brazil, at least 13 people were either crushed to death or asphyxiated at a Lima nightclub after it was raided by police for violating coronavirus restrictions. The House of Representatives voted on a bill Saturday to provide $25 billion to the U.S. Postal Service and halt any planned changes amidst growing fears that Trump is attempting to hinder the delivery of mail-in ballots ahead of November's election. The vote came one day after Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, a Trump megadonor, testified before the Senate about recent changes at the Postal Service. This is Michigan Senator Gary Peters questioning DeJoy.
Will you be bringing back any mail sorting machines that have been removed since you've become Postmaster General? Will any of those come back?
There's no intention to do that. They're not needed, sir.
So you will not bring back any processors?
They're not needed, sir.
Postal workers in Washington state and Dallas, Texas, said they have ignored orders and reinstated high-speed mail sorting machines. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports over 534,000 mail-in ballots were rejected across 23 states during this year's primaries, nearly a quarter of those in battleground states. DeJoy is testifying before the House Oversight Committee today. In other news from the House, Congress members unanimously passed a bill Saturday to provide emergency funding to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is planning to furlough around two-thirds of its employees at the end of the month. In Belarus, tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets of Minsk Sunday as demonstrations continued to call for President Alexander Lukashenko to resign 2 weeks after the longtime authoritarian leader was declared the winner of a controversial presidential election that many believe was rigged. In Colombia, at least 17 people were killed in 3 separate massacres within 24 hours, marking one of the most violent days in Colombia since the signing of a peace deal in 2016. The attacks took place Friday and Saturday in regions that have been heavily disputed between drug traffickers and other criminal groups. In the Philippines, at least 14 people have been killed and dozens of others wounded after 2 bombings in the southwestern town of Jolo. At least 5 military personnel and 4 civilians were killed, according to local reports. The attacks are the deadliest recorded in the Philippines this year, and no one's claimed responsibility. In Iraq, U.S. forces have withdrawn from Camp Taji, handing control of the military base north of Baghdad to the Iraqi army for the first time since the U.S.-led invasion in 2003. The U.S. will still have about 5,000 troops stationed in Iraq alongside 2,500 allied troops and thousands of private contractors. Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was admitted to a hospital in Germany Saturday, 2 days after he became violently ill aboard a flight from Siberia to Moscow. Navalny's sudden illness came after he was seen drinking tea at an airport cafe just before boarding his flight. A German government spokesperson said it was fairly likely Navalny was poisoned, contradicting denials by Russian doctors who treated Navalny in Siberia. He remains in a coma. In the Gulf of Mexico, Hurricane Marco weakened to a tropical storm as it approached Louisiana this morning, the first of 2 major storms expected to wallop the Gulf Coast in just 48 hours. In the Caribbean, Tropical Storm Laura flooded homes and killed at least 9 people in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It's expected to strengthen to a hurricane ahead of its landfall between Houston and New Orleans late on Wednesday. A warning to our viewers. The next 2 stories contain disturbing images of police violence. In Lafayette, Louisiana, protesters took to the streets this weekend in the wake of the police killing of a 31-year-old black man, Trayford Pellerin, on Friday. Police officers reportedly were called for a disturbance at a convenience store where they encountered Pellerin and used tasers on him before shooting him dead as he tried to enter another convenience store. Civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump, who's representing Pellerin's family, called for the officers involved to be fired. Trayford Pellerin's mother told media her son struggled with anxiety, while his aunt remembered him as quiet and generous with a big heart. Meanwhile, protests have also erupted in Kenosha, Wisconsin, following the Sunday police shooting of another black man identified as 29-year-old Jacob Blake. Video appears to show two officers shooting at Blake as he walks away from them and starts to get into a car. Blake's loved ones said on social media he's out of surgery and in stable condition. In Portland, Oregon, alt-right hate groups took to the streets again over the weekend, attacking anti-fascist protesters and others. As clashes erupted, some pointed out that Portland officials did not designate the events a riot and that police largely did not intervene, in contrast with the brutal police response toward anti-racist protesters in recent weeks. Tennessee's Republican Governor Bill Lee signed a new law which could strip protesters of their right to vote. The new law says protesters who camp out on state property could face felony charges, which would mean they automatically lose their right to vote. Kristen Clark of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law said, quote, "This is a racially motivated law intended to silence the Black Lives Matter movement." In Charlotte, North Carolina, delegates are gathering for today's opening of the Republican National Convention. President Trump is expected to make an appearance every night and will accept the nomination virtually from the White House on Thursday. Protests have been taking place in Charlotte since Friday, resulting in at least 5 arrests Saturday night. In other news from the White House, longtime advisor Kellyanne Conway said she'll be leaving her job at the end of the month, citing her family. Her husband, George Conway, also announced he's stepping back from the anti-Trump Republican group, the Lincoln Project. This comes as the couple's 15-year-old daughter, Claudia Conway, said on social media she's seeking emancipation from her parents and that she is devastated beyond compare that her mother was planning to speak at the Republican National Convention. In secretly recorded audio, President Trump's older sister, Marianne Trump Barry, calls her brother cruel and says he has no principles. The damning audio was recorded by their niece, Mary Trump, and released Saturday by the Washington Post. Marianne Trump Barry, a former federal judge in New Jersey, also appears to be the source for Mary Trump's allegation in her tell-all book about her family that Donald Trump paid a friend to take his SATs for him. Mary Trump recorded her aunt in 2018 and 19.
This goddamn tweet and the lie. Oh, my God, I'm talking too freely. But, you know, the change of stories, the lack of preparation, the lying, the holy But he's appealing to the base, what they're doing with the kids at the border. I mean...
To see our interview with Mary Trump, Donald Trump's only niece, you can go to democracynow.org. A U.S. district judge sentenced actress Lori Loughlin to 2 months in prison Friday for paying bribes to get her 2 daughters into the University of Southern California by lying about their athletic bona fides. Judge Nathaniel Gorton took Loughlin told her at her sentencing, quote, "You have participated in the corruption of the system of higher education in this country," unquote. Over 50 people have been charged as part of the college admissions scandal, which embroiled wealthy Hollywood actors, Silicon Valley executives, and hedge fund managers. Loughlin's husband, the fashion designer Massimo Giannulli, received a sentence of 5 months. And in California, the man known as the Golden State Killer was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole Friday. 74-year-old Joseph D'Angelo, a former police officer, had confessed to 13 murders and over 50 rapes. Over the course of his trial, survivors and their families took to the stand to share the impact of his crimes, which dated back to the 1970s. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. This is Breaking with Convention. The battle over the future of the U.S. Postal Service is intensifying. For weeks, Democrats have accused the Trump administration and the new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, of sabotaging the Postal Service in the lead-up to the election when a record number of mail-in ballots are expected to be cast. On Saturday, the Democrat-led House approved a bill to give the Postal Service $25 billion and to stop DeJoy from making more changes to the Postal Service, which have already led to long delays in processing and delivering mail. This is Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of Michigan.
Let it be clear, this administration is waging an authoritarian campaign to sabotage this election by manipulating the Postal Service to suppress our votes. And they are threatening the livelihood of our postal workers, our seniors, our veterans, and so many more in the process. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is fascism. We will not stand for this now or ever.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is refusing to take up the House bill. DeJoy, who is a major donor to Trump, is testifying before the House Oversight Committee today. Saturday's vote came on the same day protests were held at over 800 post offices across the country to condemn the actions of DeJoy, who became Postmaster General in June and still holds investments worth up to $75 million in assets in competitors to the U.S. Post Office or contractors with it. During a Senate hearing Friday, DeJoy claimed the cost-cutting measures he's implemented have nothing to do with the election and said the Postal Service is, quote, fully capable of delivering mail-in ballots on time. Senator Gary Peters of Michigan questioned DeJoy about his refusal to restore recently disconnected mail sorting machines.
Will you be bringing back any mail sorting machines that have been removed since you've become Postmaster General? Will any of those come back?
There's no intention to do that. They're not needed, sir.
So you will not bring back any processors?
They're not needed, sir.
While Postmaster DeJoy is refusing to reconnect the sorting machines, postal workers in Dallas, Texas, and Tacoma, Washington have defied orders and reconnected the machines. This all comes as more questions are being raised over the role of Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin in the post office shakeup. The New York Times reports Mnuchin met with 2 Republican members of the Postal Service's Board of Governors in early February and pressed them to select a Postmaster General to push Trump's agenda. We're joined now by Philip Rubio, history professor at North Carolina A&T State University, author of Undelivered, From the Great Postal Strike of 1970 to the Manufactured Crisis of the U.S. Postal Service. Prior to becoming a history professor, Rubio carried mail for the Postal Service for 20 years. It's great to have you with us, Professor Rubio. If you can talk about the latest developments, the Senate hearing on Friday, the bill that was passed, and what's expected to happen today with the House hearing. This isn't just Democrats accusing the White House and the Post Office of making it difficult or delaying the mail so that mail ballots won't get in on time. That was clearly stated by the Post Office itself, saying that they did not think they would be able to handle all this mail, though DeJoy told a very different story when he testified before the Senate Friday.
That's correct. And this Postmaster General really does have a credibility problem. He came into office just 2 months ago with claims that he was going to run it like a business and correct past inefficiencies, and he was going to first of all, clean house, replacing 23 senior management positions, and cutting overtime, banning late leaving from mail processing plants and also from stations. So, slowing the mail down in effect. And added to that, pulling up thousands of blue mail collection boxes and decommissioning these mail sorting machines, and then denying that, and then admitting that, but saying it's had not had that much of an effect. But the damage has been done. I think he's demoralized postal workers. I think he has discouraged a lot of voters who are hoping to vote by mail to vote safely and securely because of the pandemic. And he has also made, I think, people as postal consumers discouraged by promising that he will resume decommissioning these machines and these other policies of his after the election.
Have you seen anything like this before? For example, the post office in Tacoma, Washington, in Dallas, Texas, reconnecting letter sorting machines that were disconnected under orders from the Postmaster General?
Well, I can't think of anything like that, but we have to remember, on the one hand, these are isolated incidents, but on the other hand, they are revealing of what postal workers have always done in the past, taken measures into their own hands, and it's a promise of what might happen in the future. That is, postal workers, because we have to remember, postal workers are really the heart of what I would call the service culture that's still alive in the post office, okay, as opposed to the business culture of just trying to cut costs. And so, to actually take a risk at being fired for insubordination, to plugging those machines back in, we might see that takes a great effort, and we might see something like postal workers defying bans on overtime to make sure that ballots get through.
I want to go to David C. Williams, the former Postal Service Inspector General, former Vice Chair of the Postal Board of Governors. In his opening remarks to the House Progressive Caucus last week, Williams criticized Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin.
I recently resigned as the Vice Chairman of the Postal Board of Governors when it became clear to me that the administration was politicizing the Postal Service, with the Treasury Secretary as the lead figure for the White House in that effort. By statute, the Treasury was made responsible for providing the Postal Service with a line of credit. The Treasury was using that responsibility to make demands that I believe would turn the Postal Service into a political tool, ending its long history as an apolitical public infrastructure.
Can you respond to that, Professor Philip Rubio?
Well, David C. Williams was the watchdog, and he was one of two watchdogs, the other being Ronald Stroman, who also, he resigned under pressure. So they were looking out for the Postal Service, and they both resigned because they saw it being politicized. The Postal Service, or the Post Office, that we've had around for 245 years, most of that time was a political institution, but we didn't see that kind of partisan intervention, well, of course, with the exception of Andrew Jackson and the spoils system with hiring. But as far as manipulating the Postal Service and driving it into the ground, so I'm glad to see him testifying. I'm glad to see Ron Stroman, former Board of Governors member, testifying.
Are you surprised that with the enormous response across the country, the outcry, with the Postal Service having like a 91% positive rating, which delivers drugs, pharmaceuticals to veterans, to people who aren't veterans, so relied on. I mean, the VA now looking for alternatives to the USPS because they're concerned, drugs won't get to veterans on time. Are you concerned the damage has already been done, but surprised that DeJoy would say, okay, we'll hold off on changes until after the election? Now, that's really something, because it's saying to people all across the country, if you stick with this administration, we're going to gut the post office then.
No, but I'm not surprised by anything that Postmaster General DeJoy is saying, because apparently he's telling different people what he thinks they want to hear. And right now, the outrage has forced him to back down, but he is making promises that he will resume essentially dismantling the Postal Service, which was instituted in 1971 after the Great Postal Strike of 1970, and the idea being we're going to create a non-political institution, and it's going to be a hybrid government agency / business. What he assumes that he was given was a mandate to take it further in the business direction, and unintentionally and ironically, both he and Trump, I think, have dramatized how the perils of postal privatization and partisan intervention and driving our post office into the ground, that we don't have to accept this, that we shouldn't have to accept this, we shouldn't have to take it. I'm not surprised that there has been popular protest, popular outrage, because that's something that people learned from the springtime with the George Floyd protest. And so when you see people not getting their medications, when you see people not getting their mail on time, of course they're going to speak up, and they've learned that protests can change things. And I think that's forced Congress, to be, or I should say, it's encouraged Democrats in Congress to put this on the agenda, but it's still not enough. What Democrats in the House and Senate are doing is the best they can do to keep putting pressure with investigations and putting bills forward that the American people will hopefully respond to.
President Trump tweeted, I'm going to go back and look at what he tweeted, on Sunday. So now the Democrats are using mail drop boxes, which are a voter security disaster, among other things that make it possible for a person to vote multiple times. Also, who controls them? Are they placed in Republican or Democrat areas? They are not COVID sanitized, a big fraud. Now, Twitter has flagged the tweet for violating Twitter rules about civic and election integrity. He is suggesting you will get COVID if you drop your ballot into a ballot box.
So this is just more distraction that that Trump and his administration are doing, as they've done around so many other issues, but around the Postal Service. And what is gratifying is to see that lots and lots of people, including politicians, are pushing back against it, are not being satisfied with DeJoy's responses, and are rebutting Trump's claims. But what all of this does is what's intended to do is to distract and discourage. And what we have to do as individuals, as well as a collective body, is to remember that we do have a right to vote. We have a right to vote safely. The Postal Service is mandated to provide universal service, whatever that service is, even if more than half of us vote by mail, to make sure that enough overtime is in effect, enough postal workers are deployed to get all those ballots counted, for people to register and vote early, to vote in person if they feel safe enough doing that, but to vote and to keep putting pressure on the Postmaster General.
And can there anything legally be done? I mean, you've got the bill that was passed in the House, now the House hearing today. Not clear what will happen in the Senate, though it doesn't look like Mitch McConnell would take it up, though there is bipartisan attack on Trump and DeJoy. Of course, it starts at the top for going after the Postal Service, so much so that Trump inexplicably, after attacking it for so long, sent out a tweet last week saying, "Save the post office." He just didn't write "from me," from himself.
Right, and he and his wife and other administration members also vote by mail, and they are also encouraging Republicans to vote by mail. So however you vote, people need to remember that they do have a right to vote, and they do have the right to expect that the Postmaster General, who, even though it's not a very strong political position, has a lot of power and can reverse these policy changes and can also work better with the states to make sure that the ballots are counted. But in the end, it will probably come down to postal workers who make sure that that the mail does get through, just as we always did.
Well, Philip Rubio, I want to thank you for joining us. Key that you said just as we always did, because before being a historian, you were a U.S. postman for 20 years, now a history professor at North Carolina A&T State University, author of Undelivered: From the Great Postal Strike of 1970 to the Manufactured Crisis of the U.S. Postal Service. Next up, we'll look at the arrest of Trump's former campaign manager, Steve Bannon, and others on fraud charges connected to the We Build the Wall effort. We'll find out what that is. Stay with us.
We don't need no thought control. No dark sarcasm in the classroom. Teacher, leave them kids alone.
Floyd's another brick in the wall. This is Democracy Now! We're breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman. As the Republican National Convention begins this week, a sixth close associate of President Trump now faces criminal charges by the Department of Justice. Trump's former campaign manager, chief strategist Steve Bannon, is accused of defrauding donors to a private effort to build a wall along the Mexican border. He was arrested Thursday by U.S. Postal Police aboard a Chinese billionaire's $28 million yacht off the coast of Connecticut. An indictment by the Southern District of New York alleges Bannon and three others at the nonprofit We Build the Wall siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars of donations into their own pockets to support their lavish lifestyles. Bannon had promoted the group as a volunteer organization. One of the biggest donors to the project was a 7-year-old boy who set up a hot chocolate stand and raised as much as $28,000. Bannon pleaded not guilty Thursday and was released after posting $5 million bond. At the White House, reporters asked Trump about the charges.
What's your reaction to the indictment of your former campaign aide, Steve Bannon?
I haven't been dealing with him at all. I know nothing about the project other than I didn't like, when I read about it, I didn't like it. I said, this is for government, this isn't for private people. And it sounded to me like showboating, and I think I let my opinion be very strongly stated at the time. I didn't like it. It was showboating and maybe looking for funds, but you'll have to see what happens. I think it's a very sad thing for Mr. Bannon. I think it's surprising.
Meanwhile, on CBS Face the Nation Sunday, former FBI Director James Comey, who used to head the Southern District of New York, which filed the charges, said Bannon is in a, quote, world of trouble.
It's a very serious fraud case with a huge amount of money stolen from innocent victims, Americans who thought they were giving money to support the president's wall on the Mexican border, and instead it was stolen. That will drive up the potential punishments for Mr. Bannon and his co-conspirators. And you know he's in trouble because the indictment lays it out in such detail, including excerpts from texts. If you're Steve Bannon, you're his lawyers, you're reading this saying, I'm going down here.
Facing charges, along with Bannon, is We Build the Wall founder Brian Kolfage, an Iraq War veteran who was awarded a Purple Heart, lost his legs in Iraq. The Postal Inspection Service said the case, quote, should serve as a warning to other fraudsters that no one's above the law, not even a disabled war veteran or a millionaire political strategist, unquote. Not charged is Fisher Industries CEO Tommy Fisher, who was contracted to build the 3-mile stretch of wall for the group directly along the banks of the Rio Grande near Mission, Texas, near the Mexico border as a showcase project. Fisher went on to secure $1.7 billion in federal border wall contracts and claimed he was building the, quote, Lamborghini of walls. But an investigation by ProPublica last month shows the private wall project's already eroding and could be in danger of falling into the river. Their story prompted Trump to tweet on July 12th, quote, I disagreed with doing this very small, tiny section of wall in a tricky area by a private group which raised money by ads. It was only done to make me look bad, he said. This was around the same time of a dramatic showdown when the Trump administration ousted Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. attorney at the Southern District of New York, whose office went on to file these charges against Bannon. Well, for more, we're joined by two reporters with ProPublica and the Texas Tribune investigative unit who worked on the story. In one of their reports, We Build the Wall's founder Brian Kolfage actually bragged about his ties to Trump. In Houston, we're joined by Perla Trevizo. And in Austin, we're joined by Lexi Churchill. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Lexi, let's begin with you. Explain what took place on Thursday, the significance of these charges against Bannon and three others.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks so much for having me. So as you said, the U.S. Southern District of New York is charging these four men who have been involved with the group to varying degrees with conspiracy to commit wire fraud as well as money laundering. And as you stated, the indictment is very in-depth about, the matter in which that they have used a unnamed nonprofit to wire a portion of the money that this group raised last year through public funds and public donors to use as their own personal means. And that in part went to a boat called the Warfighter that has been spread widely and shared widely on the CEO, Brian Kolfage's Instagram. And, this is really just it's interesting because we started our reporting with the main question as to answer, where has this money been going? And it doesn't answer that as a whole, but it does give us some insight into where part of this has been going. And, the little that we know about it is that this group initially raised around $25 million, and they had used around $6 to $8 million on the first project that they did, and only about 5% of a $42 million project that was their second one that we have reported on, as you stated earlier. So that just doesn't quite add up to the $25 million. And this indictment has given us some insight into where some of that money has gone that we have not been able to find out.
The timing of this is just unbelievable. I mean, you have Barr pushing out Jeffrey Berman. He did not expect the pushback from Berman, not then being able to put in the guy he wanted to as the U.S. attorney. And then immediately you have Trump saying something about this project, that he doesn't support it. This is at the time they couldn't shape the prosecutor's office in the way they wanted to. And clearly this prosecution was moving ahead. Not clear if Barr was trying to stop this prosecution. So that when Bannon was arrested, Trump said, you can look at my comments weeks ago. I was against this project. But it was only when they weren't able to put the people in they wanted to in the U.S. Attorney's office.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the president had tweeted about a month ago after our initial reporting on the state of this, how this actual project is standing up, which is not great, that he did not like this project, he did not support it, and he furthered those comments trying to distance himself on Thursday when asked about it. But there is a clear connection between the president and this group. Of course, Steve Bannon, his former campaign advisor and a White House advisor for some period of time, there's no severing that relationship. He's also been involved with former Secretary of State Chris Kobach of Kansas for several years, and he served as the group's general counsel, actually, and another outspoken advocate. We have done some reporting that has also connected the president to members of the group itself, including the CEO, Brian Kolfage, who last year in an interview said that they had a direct connection to the president through Chris Kobach and others, and that he approved of what they were doing and they supported it. Amanda Shea, the company CFO, also posted a photo with Trump last year saying that she was able to meet with him and speak extensively about the project, and that he had even told her that they should bid for the whole wall.
I mean, you have this very important point that Chris Kobach, yes, the former Kansas Secretary of State, fierce anti-immigrant activist, prominent Trump supporter, serving as the advisor, as you said, to We Build the Wall, who said, I talked with the president and the We Build the Wall effort came up. Kobach told the New York Times, the president said the project has my blessing and you can tell the media that. So Trump is singing a very different tune right now. Now, while the media covered this, this is extremely significant, Bannon being arrested. I wanted to turn to Perla Trevizo, who is on the ground there in Texas, because what the media didn't cover as much is what this wall is. What did get built? What happened to it, Perla?
Yeah, so again, thank you for having us. So very little had been built. They had built roughly half a mile west of El Paso in New Mexico last year. That was on private land. And then that was fully, as Lexi said, that was fully funded by We Build the Wall, which was up to $8 million, according to reports. And then the further west in east in Texas, they built the roughly 3 miles along the river, which is the portion of the private wall that we've been focusing on. And that project was mostly funded by Fisher, which the CEO that you mentioned previously, with support from We Build the Wall. And so initially, We Build the Wall touted that as their second project. After our story and Mr. Trump tweeted that he disagreed with the project, he initially tried to distance himself from the project, saying that was not their wall. It was Fisher's project. They just had they had just donated to it. And then ultimately they went back and did say that, it was actually fake media reports and everything was fine, and went back to kind of owning that project or their contribution or support to that project.
And Fisher is, Perla?
So Tommy Fisher is the CEO of Fisher Industries and a lot of subsidiaries. He's a builder who for a while was trying to get border wall contracts, and he was not getting anywhere. And then he started appearing on conservative media outlets and kind of, trying to get to the president, they say. And so he partnered with Build the Wall to build the Sunland Park, New Mexico segment, and then the one in Texas. And they say that they wanted to show the government how the private industry could build the border wall much better than the government. While the government had not been able to build right along the river, they would show them how it could be done much cheaper and faster. And so critics say that he used those projects as kind of a showcase project to then tout to the administration and get the government contracts that you mentioned earlier. Since our stories, he's now gotten a couple more. So now it's closer to $2 billion in federal contracts for border wall fencing, most of that in Arizona.
Again, how much Fisher's gotten?
Now it's about $2 billion.
$2 billion.
$2 billion. His company has also been awarded the largest contract ever for border wall, which was $1.28 billion, almost $1.3 billion. And two of them, including that one that I just mentioned, have been awarded while an IG investigation or audit is ongoing. So after he got the first border wall contract for $400 million, Congressman Benny Thompson called for a DOD audit of that contract to ensure that there had not been undue influence or improper influence from the Trump administration. And that's still ongoing.
And talk about the wall part that was built and the environmental regulations that were gotten around and what this means in the area.
Yeah, so especially the one in South Texas, it's a very tricky area, even as Mr. Trump said. So it's very close to the river, and there's a reason why there's not a lot of border wall building going on there. Usually the government builds further inland on a levee, which has caused, its own problems because you end up dissecting properties, farmland, even cemeteries. And so this segment of the 3 miles of the wall is built very, very close to the river, which experts have told us you're always going to have a problem with erosion. And soon after Mr. Fisher completed his roughly 3 miles, you start seeing little gullies and gashes in different areas of the fence. And to be clear, Mr. Fisher and his attorney have both dismissed those concerns, said that there's normal part of erosion after you have a project like that, and that they'll continue to fix it and be responsible for it. But what we saw after Hannah is that those gullies and gushes became huge cracks. In some instances, it was waist deep. I describe it in the story. You kind of see like deep veins going into the river. And what our experts, hydrologists and engineers tell us is that the problem is that it can destabilize the foundation of the fence. And it's not that it might fall tomorrow, but if this continues because of the sand and because of the kind of loamy sand under on the bank, that you could have segments of it topple into the river, which can cause a lot of problems. And I'll just add as well, that area is controlled by a binational commission, boundary commission, because you want to make sure that whatever you do on either side of the U.S. or Mexico border is not going to impact the other side. So in this case, they have found that at least one segment of the 3 mile fence can deflect too much water onto the Mexican side when there's flooding. And so that's also currently being litigated.
I also want to talk about other people involved with this, whether or not they're indicted. Last year, Al Jazeera English host Mehdi Hassan interviewed Eric Prince, the founder of the mercenary firm Blackwater. Prince defended his involvement in the We Build the Wall fundraising project. This is Hassan questioning Eric Prince.
You are part of a group of high-profile Trump supporters, including Steve Bannon, Sheriff David Clark, and others, who are planning on raising private money to build a wall along the US-Mexico border. You even have a GoFundMe page. What I don't get, though, is I'm pretty sure I heard Donald Trump say that Mexico would be paying for the wall.
Don't discount Mexico actually paying for the wall.
I think most of us have, but yes.
The last chapter is not written on that, mark my words.
So Mexico will pay for the wall, so then why are you fundraising? You can't have it both ways. Mexico pay for the wall, but I'm going to raise money. Which one?
Because people are frustrated. They're sick of not having...
They're frustrated that the president can't get Mexico to pay for the wall 2 years into his presidency.
So that's Mehdi Hasan questioning Eric Prince. On a 2019 live streaming fundraiser, Steve Bannon, who was indicted, joked Brian Kolfage was embezzling the wall money.
Stephen K. Bannon and Brian Kolfage.
Welcome back. This is Stephen K. Bannon. We're off the coast of Saint-Tropez in southern France in the Mediterranean. We're on the $1 million yacht of Brian Kolfage. And Brian Kolfage, he took all that money from Build the Wall. No, we're actually in Sunland Park, New Mexico.
So there you have Brian Kolfage and Steve Bannon, both indicted. Let's end with Lexi Churchill, the significance of what they're saying. And before that, Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater.
Yeah. I mean, it is very startling to joke about something like that is now true and that they're now facing charges for. And I guess what I'd like to end on is, this has been the outstanding question. And because of how the group is structured as a nonprofit corporation, we have not had a lot of these answers about where the money is going and what it has been used for so far. And when we reached out to Brian Kolfage about this, he said that we would need to wait for those answers to come in once the group filed their annual report, a 990-year version of it. So we're eagerly awaiting that to see, what further information we'll be able to learn.
So finally, what happens to this wall that was already built now that these men have been indicted? And you've got Fisher Industries again. Tommy Fisher getting something like $2 billion to build the wall. Fisher Industries, the two other brothers, David and Michael, one was put in prison for child pornography. The other went to jail for environmental and workplace violations, among other things, and not paying taxes, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's worth noting that Fisher Industries does have a history of violations like the ones you mentioned, a lot EPA, environmental violation regulations, as well as MSHA, workplace safety regulations. And, I think the biggest thing is that this investigation is still ongoing into the initial contract they received for $400 million from the federal government. And we're waiting to see, what the results of that were as well, if there was any undue influences.
Well, as you will, we will continue to follow this, of course. We want to thank Lexi Churchill and Perla Treviso, the reporters with the ProPublica Texas Tribune Investigative Unit. And we'll link to your pieces. Nonprofit that financed a private border wall is now the focus of a corruption case. Next, we look at President Trump's embrace of the far-right QAnon conspiracy theory ahead of today's Republican National Convention. While the FBI sees QAnon as a domestic terrorist threat, Trump has taken a different approach. Stay with us.
Standing on the corner in the middle of the night, begging dollars from people I see, trying to book a ticket on a one-way ride up out of these dirty streets. And I don't know where I'm going no more, I don't know, and I don't care. Well, the rail car's running through these streets so fast, man, I jump on if it just slow down. There's killers on the road, so it ain't much chance of me trying and hitching around. Oh, but if I had $1, boy, find me a game, and I bet you I could turn it into $5. And if I had $5, I'd book a bullet train, and I'd ride it till the end of the line. And I don't know where I'm going no more, I don't know, and I don't care. Justice
Towns Earl. It was announced last night that Justin Townes Earle has passed away at the age of 38. He's the son of the great folk singer Steve Earle. This is Democracy Now! We're breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman. As the Republican National Convention begins tonight in Charlotte, North Carolina, questions are mounting over President Trump's decision to openly embrace the far-right conspiracy theory known as QAnon. The theory claims, among other things, that Trump is secretly at war with a deep state cabal of Satan-worshipping elites who run a child sex trafficking operation. Over the years, Trump has repeatedly retweeted messages from supporters of the conspiracy theory, but last week, Trump talked publicly about the movement for the first time when asked.
Well, I don't know much about the movement other than I understand they like me very much, which I appreciate. These are people that don't like seeing what's going on in places like Portland and places like Chicago and New York and other cities and states. And I've heard these are people that love our country, and they just don't like seeing it. So I don't know really anything about it other than they do supposedly like me.
At the crux of the theory is this belief that you are secretly saving the world from this satanic cult of pedophiles and cannibals. Does that sound like something you are behind?
Well, I haven't heard that, but is that supposed to be a bad thing or a good thing? I mean, you know, if I can help save the world from problems, I'm willing to do it.
That's President Trump being questioned by an NBC reporter at the White House. Trump's remarks came just a week after a supporter of QAnon, Marjorie Taylor Greene, won the Republican primary in Georgia's heavily Republican 14th congressional district. Last year, the FBI warned QAnon and other conspiracy theories pose a domestic terror threat. We're joined now by Angela Carasone, president of Media Matters, the media watch group monitoring right-wing misinformation in the U.S. media. Wow. Angela, lay this out for us. I mean, it goes beyond what I said, this idea, bring in the pizzeria, Hillary Clinton, etc.
Yeah, sure. So QAnon is sort of like phase two of a conspiracy theory that I think a lot of people would be familiar with, which started during the 2016 presidential campaign called Pizzagate. And that theory was that Hillary Clinton, among others, were running a child sex trafficking ring out of a basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. And one of the individuals who believed in this conspiracy theory actually went to investigate it himself and, brought a gun, fired some shots. The pizza parlor doesn't even have a basement. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, but that person was arrested. And what happened from then, though, was that people still believed in that theory. They still believed that there was actually a child sex trafficking ring being run by Hillary Clinton. It's just that they had the wrong pizza place. And so when Trump took office, shortly after, one of the things that happened is this entity, this individual named Q, identified as Q, started dropping these secret clues onto 4chan and 8chan, these message boards, that members, readers would consume and try to decipher and decode. And that basically has metastasized into the domestic terror threat that you referenced earlier, which is that now you have a fairly widespread belief amongst largely conservatives that Democrats, the media, and parts of the government are operating together in cahoots to take down Donald Trump, and that the reason they want to take down Donald Trump is because he's the only person that is trying to stop their child sex trafficking ring. And the reason why they run this child sex trafficking ring, according to these believers, is that they're either sadists, psychic vampires, or interdimensional demons. There's a lot of disagreement within the movement as to what is actually driving this need for child sex trafficking, but a big piece of it believes that they're either interdimensional demons or psychic vampires. And at the center is this belief in this entity called Q, which is supposedly somebody in the government that is working with Donald Trump, secretly leaking all of these documents.
I even hesitated to do this today because whether or not you're critiquing it, you become a super spreader. It keeps getting a super spreader of misinformation because it keeps getting repeated. But You now have the recent Georgia primary where the Republican winner of the primary actually openly embraces the QAnon theory. Explain what happened there.
Sure. And so Marjorie Taylor Greene won her primary and then a runoff. It's in a very conservative district. She's almost certain to win in the general election. And essentially, she's somebody who fully believes, one, in Q, in that entity. She believes it's a real entity. The second thing, though, is that she's actively evangelized for it. She has, repeatedly told people if they don't subscribe to this or they're uncertain about it, not to feel bad, but to reach out to her privately, and she will help walk them through the importance of Q. She has repeatedly called Q a patriot. That's why I think it's important to realize that when Trump said the thing that he said, it's not just that he didn't condemn it, but that when he reinforced the fact that the people in QAnon love their country, that they're patriots, that is a central tenet of what QAnon believers sort of tell themselves, and also what they use to help bring others into the movement, is that they're actually the true patriots that are out there, really trying to save the country and the world from this sort of interdimensional psychic fight. And I would just point out that Marjorie Taylor Greene is not the only QAnon believer that's on the ballot in November. There are 20 full QAnon adherents on the ballot in November. 75 were running in the primaries for Congress and Senate, but 20 made their way to the ballot in November. So that's another thing. I think at this point it's reached full spread that we really can't ignore it anymore.
And you have the new slogan adopted by the Texas Republican Party, "We are the storm," which is a nod to QAnon. Is that right?
It is. Before that sort of transition period in the early days of Q, when they were sort of going from Pizzagate to full QAnon, there was a period where they kept believing that the storm was coming, which is a reference to a massive crackdown from Donald Trump, where he was going to expose the deep state and expose this ring of psychic vampires or demons. And they kept referring to this as this sort of prophecy that was about to unfold. And in fact, there was an incident in 2018 where an armed man, took over the Hoover Dam, and there was a standoff with law enforcement. And one of the things that he was screaming was, "Release the OIG, Office of Inspector General report." He was a full QAnon believer. Thankfully, nobody was hurt in that. But the reason he took it over was actually to help speed along the timeline, because a lot of QAnon believers were under the impression that the Office of Inspector General report would have exposed the deep state at the time, that it was part of this storm. And so "Release the Storm" is one of the big things you hear. The other one is "Where we go one, we go all," which is a code word that a lot of QAnon users use to sort of identify each other and also help evangelize. We saw that a lot this summer.
Michael Flynn, right? July 4th with his entire family.
That's exactly it. When he took the oath, which is, I think, part of the reason why QAnon is so different than a lot of people believe, conspiracy theories, and a lot of them are harmful, and most of them are just harmless and ridiculous. And but what's different about QAnon is that it's so inherently linked to violence that you really believe, in order to become a believer, that you have to stand and fight. That this is sort of the existential threat of our time. And that basically the ends justify the means. So when Michael Flynn took that oath, which is what he was doing, him and his family and all these other believers were taking the oath. They were taking the oath to defend the Constitution, to put their lives on the line if need be. And at the end, they signed it off with that slogan as sort of a way to get others to do the same thing. And it took hold right around 4th of July.
Angela, we have 10 seconds. What are you looking for at the Republican National Convention this week?
I think a lot of it's going to be, a wink and a nod to what we're seeing in the fever swamps of the right wing. I would just note that power right now is really being organized on what we would have once sort of considered the fringes. And I think being able to draw those dots is something that I'm going to be paying much close attention to.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us, Angela Carasone, president of Media Matters, which monitors right-wing misinformation in the U.S. media. That does it for our show. We'll be with you all week covering the Republican National Convention from Charlotte to the White House. Tune in to our Breaking with Convention series. I'm Amy Goodman. Wear a mask. Stay safe.